My name is Mark Bodanza, and I'm here to introduce you to our new documentary series, Nation Rising. The purpose of this film is not only to introduce you or to recount the history of our young nation, but it's also to tell you about how our local story intermixes or intermingles with that national picture. Not only because of Leominster's citizens' contributions to our national events, but also how those national events impacted us locally so long ago. Today I'm actually standing in Lancaster because, of course, Lancaster was Leominster's mother town. And in 1740, about a century after Lancaster was first settled, Leominster was carved. In 1643, barely a generation after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, English settlers came to this very spot I'm standing on to make their first inroads to this part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or what would become the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it's important for us to understand the story of our nation's history as well as Leominster's history to understand how Lancaster was formed.
In the beginning, they came for religious freedom. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock were Puritans. They separated from the Church of England and followed the philosophy of John Calvin, a French theologian and Protestant reformer. One of the chief features of Puritanism was the concept of predestination, that God chooses beforehand those who will come to Him and receive Him for salvation. This does not mean that humanity was without free will, but only that it mysteriously ran parallel with the sovereignty of the Almighty God. Non-separatist Puritans formed the Massachusetts Bay Colony. While they differed with the Church of England, like the separatists, they were Puritans who wanted to reform the church from within. We are taught with textbooks and ingrained with the notion that the Puritans came to establish a religious freedom in the New World. The postage service even issued a stamp in 1957 celebrating this fundamental idea. New England Puritans were anything but tolerant of other religious beliefs. When they arrived on the shores of a new and foreboding land, a dark wooded place with savages lurking seen and unseen, they came to establish their own religion. They came not only to practice their religion, but also for the opportunity to acquire land and the abundant resources of the New World.
Think back to your school days when you were taught all about the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock and why they came here for religious freedom. And think about the notion that you had that America was created, in part at least, so that people could practice their religion freely. Well, that wasn't exactly true in the 17th century when the Pilgrims came. In fact, it wasn't true at all. There were more than one religion. There was Puritanism, and there were Quakers, for example, in New England. Prior to 1660, Quakers were persecuted by the Pilgrims or Puritans to the extent that some of them were actually executed. The king in 1660 changed this and outlawed such harsh punishments for Quakers, but not all of the punishment went away. Which brings me to the story of Lydia Wardell, who was a woman who lived with her husband in Hampton, New Hampshire, which in those days, 1663 to be specific, was under the jurisdiction of Massachusetts. She was supposed to, by law, attend meeting, which meant Puritan meeting, at the Newbury Meeting House in Massachusetts, but she didn't. And when she refused to attend a church that she wanted nothing to do with, she was fined and she was punished. In protest of the punishment and the fines, she decided to show up at church one day completely naked. And as you can imagine, this didn't go over very well with the Puritan leaders of the community. So they decided to punish her for her heinous misdeed. How did they punish her? They stripped her down naked to the waist and they whipped her. Just a little bit of an idea how religious freedom worked in 1663 Massachusetts.
The Great Puritan Migration. 25,000 came from England to New England. 50,000 more set sail for the West Indies. Most, but not all, of the intrepid souls were Puritans. English settlers gradually ventured away from the sea into the inner reaches of New England. In 1643, a group of Englishmen, led by Thomas King, established a trucking station in a place called the Nashaway plantation, in search of iron deposits and to trade with the Native Americans. This was the beginning of Lancaster. Lancaster was a praying town, one of about 14 established to convert Native Americans to Christianity. On October 28, 1646, John Eliot, a Puritan missionary, preached his first sermon to Native Americans at Natick, another praying town, one that has retained its Indian name. Eliot preached the Christian Bible to the Massachusetts and Algonquin tribes. In 1663, Eliot published a translation of the English Bible to the Massachusetts language. About 1,000 copies of the Bible were originally printed, and of those only 39 copies are thought to survive. American college libraries and American collectors are thought to own 29 of the books, and the other 10 are in Europe. Williams College in Massachusetts and Dartmouth College in New Hampshire own copies. Not all of the Native Americans were interested in adopting the white settlers' ways or their religion. The advent of King Philip's War in 1675 brought missionary activities to an end. Most of the original printing of Eliot's Bible was destroyed by the English during King Philip's War. King Philip's War was led by Native American Metacomet, called Philip by the colonists. The Native Americans took a stand against further encroachment on their lands by the English colonists. The flashpoint that ignited the war was the murder of a Christian Indian named John Sassamon. Sassamon had warned Plymouth Colony of coming Indian attacks on English settlements. His warning was ignored. Soon after, Sassamon's body was recovered from a frozen pond. 3 Wampanoag men were tried, convicted, and hanged for Sassamon's murder. Metacomet, the Wampanoag chief, had enough. Metacomet was the second son of Massasoit. You might remember that name as the Indian who negotiated a peace treaty between the Native Americans and the colonists at Plymouth Plantation. If that doesn't do it, you'll recognize Massasoit from the Massachusetts state flag and seal. Metacomet's older brother, Wamsuta, later named Alexander, died in 1662 while being questioned by the English on suspicion of plotting war. This opened a clear path for Metacomet to come to power. When the conflict came, the Indian War Confederacy included not only the Wampanoag, but the Algonquin, Nipmuc, and Narragansett. The destruction caused by the Indian raids was catastrophic. Lancaster, incorporated as a town since 1653, suffered a devastating attack during the winter of 1676. There had been trouble since the prior August. On February 10, 1676, 400 Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Nipmuc warriors attacked the town. They burned the bridge into town, homes, and the meeting house. It is estimated that 14 Lancaster residents were killed in the attack, and another 23 taken into captivity. One of the captives was the minister's wife, Mary Rowlandson. Her husband was in Boston at the time to plead for more troops to secure Lancaster.
At length they came and beset upon our house, and quickly it was the dolefullest day that mine eyes ever saw. The house stood upon the edge of a hill. Some of the Indians got behind the hill, others into the barn, and others behind anything that could shelter them. From all which places they shot against the house, so that the bullets seemed to fly like hail, and quickly they wounded one man among us, and then another, and then a third. About 2 hours they had been about the house before they prevailed to fire it, which they did with flax and hemp, which they brought out of the barn. There being no defence about the house, only 2 flankers at 2 opposite corners, and one of them not finished. They fired it once, and one ventured out and quelled it, but they quickly fired it again, and that took. Now at that dreadful hour come, that I have often heard of in time of war, as it were the case of others, but not mine eyes see it. Some of our house were fighting for their lives, others wallowing in their blood. The house on fire over our heads, and the bloody heathen ready to knock us on the head if we stirred out. Now might we hear mothers and children crying out for themselves and one another, Lord, what shall we do? I took my children, one of my sisters and hers, to go forth and leave the house. But as soon as we came to the door and appeared, the Indians shot so thick that the bullets rattled against the house, as if one had taken a handful of stones and thrown them, so that they were vain to give back. The fire increasing and coming along behind us, roaring, and the Indians gaping before us with their guns, spears, hatchets, to devour us. No sooner were we out of the house, but my brother-in-law, being before wounded in defending the house and or near the throat, fell down dead, whereat the Indians scornfully shouting and howled, and were presently upon him, stripped off his clothes, the bullets flying thick. One went through me side, and the same as would seem through the bowels and hand of my dear child in my arms. One of my eldest sister's children, named William, had his leg broken, which the Indians perceiving, they knocked him on head. Thus were we butchered by those merciless heathen, standing amazed with the blood running down to our heels. My eldest sister being yet in the house and seeing those woeful sights, the infidels hailing mothers one way and children another, and some wailing in their blood, and her eldest son telling her that her son William was dead and myself was wounded. She said, and Lord, let me die with him. and fell down dead over the threshold. I hope she is reaping the fruits of her good labors.
There was so little left of the towns, including stores and livestock pilfered by the warriors, that Lancaster was abandoned. Not until June 1684 did civilization fully return to the town with construction of a new meeting house. Mary Rowlandson famously survived 3 months in captivity. Her return was negotiated by John Hoare of Concord at what is known today as the Redemption Rock on Route 140 in Princeton. In 1682, she wrote the story of her ordeal, titled The Captive, which has been widely regarded as classic American literature. Some 40 editions have been published over 3 centuries. 3 children went into captivity with Rowlandson: Joseph, Mary, and Sarah. Mary died from the wounds she suffered in the attack 1 week into the family's captivity. The other 2 children were returned with their mother.
On Tuesday morning, they called their general court, as they called it, to consult and determine whether I should go home or no. And they all as one man did seemingly consent to it, that I should go home, except Philip, who would not come among them. Oh, the wonderful power of God that I have seen, and the experience that I have had. I have been in the midst of those roaring lions and savage bears, and feared neither God nor man, nor the evil by night or day, alone in a company, sleeping all sorts together. And yet, not one of them ever offered me the least abuse or unchastity to me, in word or action. Though some are ready to say I speak this for my own credit, I speak it in the presence of God and to His glory. God's power is as great now and as sufficient to save as when He preserved Daniel in the lion's den, or the 3 children in the fiery furnace. I may well say His Psalm 107:13. Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for He is good, for His mercy endureth forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom He hath redeemed from the hand of the enemy. Especially that I should come away in the midst of so many hundreds of enemies quietly and peacefully, and not a dog moving his tongue. So I took my leave of them, and in coming along, my heart melts into tears, more than all the while I was with them, and I was almost swallowed up by the thoughts that I ever should go home again.
King Philip's War effectively ended in August 1676, when the English finally cornered Metacomet and his warriors in a battle that claimed the chief's life. Metacomet was killed by John Elderman, a praying Indian. He was beheaded and his body quartered. Metacomet's head was put on a pike outside Plymouth Colony, where it remained for 25 years. Thousands of Native Americans were killed, captured, and either sold into slavery or indentured as a result of the fighting. The war decimated the Native American tribes of southern New England. It greatly dampened Indian resistance to the growing English influence in the region. The English dream of evangelizing the native population into a city on the hill was fading fast. When Lancaster was finally reoccupied, there was a period of calm. Despite war between England and France coming in 1689, King William's War in North America, War of the League at Augsburg in Europe, No Indian aggressions were experienced in the town until 1692. The story of what happened in Lancaster that year takes us to Leominster's Pine Grove Burial Ground.
This afternoon, I'm standing here at the final resting place of Peter Joslin. Back at his day, he was one of Leominster's oldest residents. He lived to the ripe old age of 94, surviving 4 wives. This is a place that many people drive by every day. Pine Grove Cemetery. It's on busy Route 12 near the junction of Route 13. And countless car trips pass by this cemetery on a daily basis. And many of you may have been in here at some time or other, but you would have probably not known that Mr. Joslin's history goes back to a pivotal time in Massachusetts Bay Colony, that year being 1692.
Peter Joslin tilled the earth and maintained a farm in Lancaster with his first wife. His life would be forever changed on a summer day in 1692. The year 1692 also marked the end to the Plymouth colony, it having been absorbed into Massachusetts to be governed by royal authority. On July 18, 1692, Peter Joslin went to work in his fields. He was accompanied by one of his younger boys, who, according to David Wilder's 1853 history, had assigned as a reason that he had seen some red men in the hemp.
But the father heeded him not.
While the Joslin males were away from their modest farmhouse, Indians attacked. It was baking day, and Mrs. Joslin fought desperately with her bread shovel until receiving a fatal blow from a tomahawk. 3 Joslin children and a widow named Whitcomb were also killed. Another Joslin child and Peter's sister-in-law, Elizabeth Howe, were taken captive. His child was put to death by the Indians in the wilderness. Elizabeth Howe survived not only the attack, but also her captivity, being later released. She was spinning on the wheel and singing a sweet melody at the time of the assault. Legend has it that she was spared by the pleasing sound of her voice at the time of the attack and later while a captive. (1692) was an extraordinary year, not only for Mr. Joslin, but for all of New England.
And of course, one of the things that was happening in that long ago time were the Salem witchcraft trials. There was an overabundant, overarching type of feeling that in the colony back in those days that the evil perpetrated by the Puritans was being punished by God. I always found it fascinating that I could walk through this quiet resting place and for many times not know the story of Mr. Joslin, discover it at some point, and then come back here and revere what this man went through those centuries ago. I think it kind of gives us a reminder that, history, things that have gone before are important, and we should pay attention to them. Sometimes they're right under our foot, and we don't have any idea what they're all about, but it's important for us to look back, and it's important for us to remember, and I think Mr. Joslin's resting place, or final resting place, is a perfect example of that notion.
The Native American tribe that controlled what was Lancaster and its surroundings, including Leominster, were the Nashaway, at one time led by the Sachem chief Sholin, who camped at the shores of Lake Washaycom in what is now Sterling. The Nashaway were planters and cultivators who preferred the rich soil of the low banks of the river they shared a name with, Nashwa, meaning the land between. There, between the two branches of the river, they farmed for a long but unknown number of years without disturbance. They were a mostly peaceful tribe, but before too much of the 18th century had passed, their ranks were thinned by hostilities with other tribes, displacement by white settlers, and disease. The tribe, which would ultimately suffer extinction, would however play a key role in the town which was to become Leominster.